So today, as I said, begins Banned Books Week, and I am a lover of books, as many of us here are. And so I've often thought about preaching about banned books, but seldom done so. Now, traditionally, I'm against banning books, and I'll bet that's true for most of you. It goes against some of our fundamental values in this faith: freedom of belief, freedom of thought, freedom of action. One of our principles in the UU Principles, which you can find in your hymnals, is the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. And that principle seems to argue against ever banning a book. Books get on the top 10 list of challenged books when there is an attempt to remove a book from a library or a curriculum, whether or not that book is successful. So the books we're referencing today have all been challenged in different ways. And historically, liberals have been on the side of allowing books, and the reasons they're challenged are usually due to conservative reasons. Often the books have something about sex in them, for example. In recent years, many of the challenges come from LGBT content. In fact, on this year's top 10 challenged books list, 5 of the books, the top 5 books, were challenged because of LGBT content, and in a couple cases, specifically transgender content. 3 of the others were challenged because of sexual content. So sex and sexual orientation and gender identity makes up for 8 of those books on the top 10 list. In case you're curious about the other 2, one was a book by Bill Cosby, challenged because of the allegations against the author, and the 10th book was challenged for offensive language. The previous year was similar, with the main reasons being LGBT content and sex, but also 3 books on the list that year for religious reasons. Again, a reason we're often against banning books is because it's sometimes about stifling freedom of religion as well. So in 2015, there was a book with a Muslim character, a book with a character who says he doesn't believe in God, and then there was the Bible. In my opinion, though I haven't read a study on it, I think that a lot of the time the reason why the Bible becomes so challenged is that it's often done as a counter-challenge. So when people from a more fundamentalist conservative perspective want to challenge books with sexual content, nudity, and violence, people often challenge the Bible in response, showing its sexual content, nudity, and violence. Thus, it becomes a frequently challenged book, although not cracking the top 10 until a couple of years ago. But here and there on the list, you will find a book challenged for what I would call liberal reasons. One example is that Bill Cosby book, challenged because of sexual assault allegations against its author. Another example is when books like To Kill a Mockingbird or Huckleberry Finn are challenged because of racist language, even though the books are written against racism. And there are times when I can imagine that I might object to a book in a curriculum myself, if my daughter was being asked to read something. For instance, I've learned recently that the Ayn Rand Institute has a really aggressive policy of marketing objectivism and Ayn Rand books to schools and curricula to teachers. And so there are schools where it's required reading that you read Atlas Shrugged or The Fountainhead in high school every year, or like that everybody reads it at the same year. So in 2013, a legislator in Idaho actually tried to make Atlas Shrugged mandatory for all high schoolers in the state. If I thought my child's school was trying to indoctrinate her into Ayn Rand's objectivist thought, I might very well object to that. For those who are not familiar with objectivism, here it is summed up as a philosophy. Objectivists believe that one should pursue one's own happiness at the exclusion of all else. And they believe really that there is no other thing one can do, that every act that looks altruistic is really an act that serves oneself, so one might as well just be honest about it and serve oneself. And they believe that the only good system that allows one to fully pursue one's own happiness at the expense of everybody and everything else is capitalism, specifically laissez-faire capitalism. So in recent years, I think more and more challenges are coming from the left, and I wanted to spend some time analyzing that point of contention for us, because I think that's where sometimes our values come into conflict with one another. I think there's a struggle in the political left that will translate to some of the struggle that I see going on in the religious left as well, and it goes deep into our values, and I'm still puzzling it through. It's still difficult for me to understand in many ways. So this is, in some ways, a sermon that is not completely resolved. At the core of it, there's a struggle between two deeply held values. This value of intellectual freedom that we enshrine in songs and our hymnals, that free and responsible search for truth and meaning, as our principles put it, the value of human rights, human worth, and then on the other side, the value of human rights, human worth, human dignity, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, as our principles put it. When we often hear about this conflict is in publications from the right that charge, for example, that there's a war on free speech on college campuses. So you can see the connection between free speech and banned books. That's a free speech issue. And the right says there's a war on free speech going on college campuses. One example of where this war on free speech often surfaces is around something called trigger warnings. Are you all familiar with the concept of trigger warnings? No, I didn't think so, because this is kind of a college campus thing. So a trigger warning is when someone gives a spoken or written warning that something they're going to say or write might be considered offensive or triggering. So conservatives will say something like this quote from a British baroness who holds an office that deals with student complaints in England. And here I am quoting from Breitbart from the pulpit from the first time. Quote, "They claim a right not to be offended, but we cannot secure freedom of expression if we all also maintain a right not to be offended." But if you really look at what a trigger warning is, the conflict between it and free speech is less clear than it might at first seem. A student who requests a trigger warning is not asking for a right not to be offended, but asking for a right not to be triggered. And the trigger comes not from not having to discuss information, and it comes not from the discussion. They're not saying, I don't want the class to discuss this, but from having to enter into that conversation without adequately mentally being able to prepare oneself. They're not asking for content to be removed usually, but for content to come with a warning label. So the idea of a trigger warning comes from understanding people with PTSD. Imagine a classic scenario of a former soldier who jumps and ducks for cover whenever they suddenly hear a big bang that sounds like a gunshot. That's being triggered, that hearing the bang and jumping in response to it. You were triggered by the bang and you responded. Now, a trigger warning is simply saying, okay, I'm about to make a big bang. What happens now? Sometimes the soldier doesn't jump. They're prepared. They steeled themselves knowing the big bang was coming. And of course, war isn't the only thing that causes trauma. So imagine a student who is a rape survivor, and they're going to be reading a book that they don't know has a graphic rape scene in it. If they enter into that book unknowingly, it can sweep them back into their trauma and trigger their PTSD effects. Imagine a student who had been raped in their home, reading the book alone at home, not knowing that that was going to be in the book. Now, imagine the same student gets a trigger warning. What can they do? They can ask to skip that section. They can get an alternative reading assignment. That's asking to be protected from the content, true, but not asking the whole class to avoid it or for the book to be banned. Or maybe they choose to engage with the book, but make sure that they do so in a way that will trigger them the least. So if they would be triggered more at home and alone, they read it in a busy coffee shop or with a trusted friend nearby. With the trigger warning, they're equipped to escape or avoid the negative reaction. So when we examine it, asking for this courtesy of trigger warnings isn't actually creating a lack of freedom of speech or freedom of intellectual exploration or freedom of thought. It's not the same as asking to ban a book and remove it from our libraries. All the freedoms are retained, and yet protections are still in place for someone else. But there are harder issues on the left than that, and which is the most easily understood once you get past the obfuscation of the issue from the right. Harder issues are the ones we've seen this summer, like statue removal, protesting a speaker coming to campus, protesting a rally. Just as fervently as I believe in the right to freedom of speech, I believe in the right to protest. It's a basic right to protest racist speakers, protest racist statues, and protest racist rallies of outright racism by racists. Until this summer, I always knew I stood firmly on the rights of people to march. Let the Nazis march in Skokie. I was with the ACLU on that one. Let the Nazis march wherever they want. And as for speakers on college campuses, I think we have the right, but I do think we have the right, particularly if one is paying tuition, to put pressure on a university not to bring in a certain speaker with their money if it's a state school with our money. I don't think we have to agree to pay for hate speech and to support it and give it a home. And that's where the conflict comes in with our libraries too. What if we're supporting hate speech in our libraries by paying for a book and bringing it in and cataloging it? And then I start to realize, my values are in conflict. Statues, I would put them all in some sort of Civil War glorification museum. But again, that's paying for their removal and their housing with taxpayer money. And I'm a little uneasy with that too. So I think we saw vividly this summer that the goals of the Nazis and white supremacists are to provoke violence. They want violence to happen, and then they can claim the mantle of victimhood. And also what we saw this summer was they have a willingness to commit violence when their voices are countered. Let's face it, the KKK was never known as a peaceful, law-abiding organization. And Nazis were never known for standing up for human rights and protecting all peoples. These are people who are effectively trying to start a race war with all the tools in their toolkit right now, here in America. That was Dylann Roof's goal when he shot and killed people in a church in Charleston, South Carolina. He wanted to start a race war. That was the goal of the white supremacists marching in Charlottesville, Virginia. That's what's going on at the University of Michigan campus this week. So the answer isn't always as simple as focusing on freedom of speech and protecting it at all costs, because we have to look at what is that cost. I still do believe we need to protect freedom of speech, and I'm going to read all the banned books I can, but we have to balance that freedom of speech with protecting our other rights and our other freedoms at the same time. So this past spring, I went to a workshop put on by a group of local police and community members working together. Our group is called ALPACT, which stands for something like Police and Community Trust. So their goal is to build trust between the police and the community. And the workshop that they were holding was about defining and understanding what a hate crime is. And what we learned is that hate crimes are very difficult to prove. You have to meet a strict set of criteria in order to legally say that was a hate crime. Some people have often wondered why a hate crime would get a higher sentence than a similar crime that wasn't motivated by hate. And I understand that question. It seems logical. A murder is a murder is a murder. Arson is arson is arson. But the difference is this. A hate crime terrorizes the community. It's meant to not only be the crime itself, but meant also to cause fear, cause terror in the victim and the community the victim represents. So an arson isn't just an arson, it's an arson plus terror. And a murder isn't just a murder, it's a murder plus terror. A burned cross on your lawn is not just vandalism, it is vandalism plus threat. And that's what makes it different. So when we apply this to the concept of free speech is not just always freely speaking, it's sometimes speech plus threat, speech plus terror. In our community, we have hate crimes. We saw hate crimes this summer with the arson at the Pride Center director's home. I saw it last year with a member of the LGBT community who had their rainbow flag in front of their house ripped down repeatedly and destroyed. And an LGBT person in this community who I know this summer had their window in their house shot out. And at the same time, we have a mayor in Jackson and a police department who say they see no evidence of hate crimes or hateful actions against LGBT people in this community. And that march for white supremacy may have been in Charlottesville, but there were people there marching with Michigan symbols on them. And And we had the LGBT bar in Ann Arbor vandalized this summer. And we have racist incidents on the U of M campus this week erupting. And what all of this is telling me is that first, white supremacy is alive and strong. Second, white supremacy and anti-Semitism and anti-gay sentiments are alive and strong in our community. And third, those who are holding that hate and that feeling of superiority in their hearts and minds are willing to commit violence and vandalism in order to achieve their ends. And their ends are white supremacy. Their ends end with a white country and everyone else dead or on the boat. And that's not hyperbole. That's their stated goals in the white supremacist movement. So this started off with banned books and ended up with white supremacy, and some of banned books is about the same stuff. It's about controlling your thought, controlling your access, controlling what ideas are shared in America. Some of banning books is about fascism at work there too, trying to limit what America can be and shove it back down to the point of view of only a few chosen few. So it's tricky, my friends. We have to learn to examine the situations closely and the motives closely. A hate crime isn't a hate crime unless the motive was hate. So let's look at the motivations of when people are talking about challenging books. Is their motivation to protect someone from trauma, or is their motivation to limit your freedom of thought? And when it comes to protecting the vulnerable, when it comes to protecting people from something, is it about protecting the vulnerable or about protecting the powerful? So we have to examine and hold all that in conflict, and white supremacy too. In the end, our principles call on us to respect, and I would argue to protect, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. They call for us to watch out for a world of racism, sexism, of homophobia, and to counter it. They call on us also to affirm and promote the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, which I take to mean that we need to protect free speech and free inquiry. And sometimes that does come down to protecting the abhorrent. Actually, they both do. And that's where we struggle with our principles in light of the real world. What does it mean to respect the inherent worth and dignity of Nazis? And to what extent do we want to defend symbols of public racism in our public squares? These are the issues that our time and our principles are calling us to wrestle with. And I don't have all the answers. But for now, and as for books, I'm going to keep on reading, and I hope you will too.